Now, unlike corn or soybeans, cattle have to be tended to year-round. But just because it's cold outside, your animals can still be successfully grazed on dormant winter forage. But there are some important things you need to know. University of Nebraska range and forage specialist Dr. Mitch Stephenson joined me to discuss a few things to consider to keep your cows healthy during the winter months.
A lot of producers are realizing that year-round grazing is benefit economically, and the cattle can do very well grazing year-round, including winter grazing. And here we are in the middle of our winter grazing season right now. And so there's been a lot of questions about how to best manage my winter grazing. How does this affect subsequent year production and sustainability of my grasses? There has been quite a bit of research looking at the season of grazing, the season of grazing is one of the foundational principles of grazing management, along with appropriate stocking rates as well as distribution of cattle across the landscape, or how they graze across the landscape, and so season of use. And so typically in the wintertime, the grasses that we see above ground are typically what has grown the previous year. It's dormant. Most of the carbohydrates have been translocated to the crowns of the roots, and so the quality of the grass is often not nearly as good as when it's growing during the growing season. And so, for example, winter forage quality might be less than 5% crude protein, whereas during the growing season it's substantially higher. And so this 5% crude protein is probably not enough to meet the needs of cattle during this time. And so with proper supplementation, cattle can utilize this forage. So it really is remarkable how cattle can utilize relatively low quality forage and still do very well with the proper supplementation.
Gotcha. So can you talk to us about the best time of year for grazing and how grazing during the winter time is going to impact things as it gets warmer?
First off, to answer that question, we need to think about what type of grasses we have out there. And so there's a lot of variability across Nebraska in the type of grass species that you'll see. But typically we break it down into functional groups. So are they cool season, meaning that they typically grow, put most of their growth on in May and early June, or are they warm season where they put more of their growth on in July and August. And for example, in the sandhills, we have about a mixture of about 40% warm season grasses and about 30% cool season grasses by weight of the total production. And so understanding what types of grasses you have out there really has an influence on that. And so when you know that, you can kind of make some better plans. So with our warm season grasses, we know that when they're in that elongation phase, so in July and August, when they're really putting a lot of energy to growing, that's typically the most detrimental time to graze. For our cool season grasses, some of our research conducted in the sandhills has shown that fall grazing can actually have a negative effect on some of our cool season grasses. Whereas here in the wintertime, typically grazing doesn't have a really strong influence on subsequent year production or sustainability. So it's probably the least detrimental time to graze on some of our rangelands.
So as far as adequate forage, and I think you touched on that earlier on in the interview, what do producers need to know here? And maybe what are some things that would make a farmer say, maybe let's not graze here anymore this season? What can you tell us?
Sure. And so the big thing is to make a plan and to really have a good idea of what your pastures can support. And then when you have that plan in place, every year is going to be a little bit different because of our precipitation variability that we have in Nebraska and across the Great Plains. And so really having a plan in place, and then visual observations. Typically you want to leave enough plant material so that photosynthetic process can keep going after you leave. Mm-hmm. And so typically we recommend 3 to 4 inches of stubble height on some of those grasses, and then allowing adequate time for those grasses to recover before you come back into a pasture.
And also, to wrap it up, we have that general rule of thumb of take half, leave half. Could you remind us what that means and how that applies to winter grazing?
Yeah, absolutely. So the take half, leave half, that general rule of thumb is based on some science that was conducted quite a while ago, as where they come to this. But by leaving enough plant material above ground, it allows there to not be a reduction in the root biomass below ground. And so they looked at several different percentages of clipping and grazing on some of these species, and that's kind of what they determined with that. In the wintertime, you can take a little bit more typically. However, you still want to leave enough for cover. I mean, really having enough litter and standing biomass out there is important for erosion control, keeping your ecosystem healthy, and also a lot of that standing dead material ends up providing really good wildlife habitat for a lot of our birds and other species.